All right, well, welcome everyone to week number 2 of the summer session. Hope everyone is doing well. Uh, I taught on Monday night to a different course and I had some connectivity issues. So I just want to full disclosure, let you know that happened on Monday. And I've learned that if I turn my camera off, I can save a lot on bandwidth. So I'm not being rude or anything, but tonight I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video just to save that bandwidth and hopefully we won't have any connectivity problems tonight. If you do notice any connection problems, so if the microphone sounds a little glitchy or you hear some static in the microphone, please do let me know. Just shoot me a text in text chat or just through your microphone, let me know. So because again, I've changed a lot of things out from Monday night, and so I've got a new laptop I'm using. I have a new microphone that I'm using. The only thing that has not been changed is the internet connection. So if there's a problem again tonight, I'll narrow it down to know it is the internet. But do please let me know if there's any issue with the way in which I sound, and we'll try and troubleshoot it. But as long as the camera is off, I think I'll save a lot on bandwidth and hopefully we'll be good to go for the evening. So again, welcome back to week number 2. Thank you for your responses on Canvas essay number 1, where you shared your organization that you will then be using for your organizational analysis paper and then also for your presentation. Every response I got that I received before about 5 o'clock today, I was able to read all of those and then provide feedback on those. I didn't have any issues with any of the organizations that anyone cited. I think all the organizations should work well for the assignments in the course. So you have my blessing, if you will, to go ahead and use those organizations. The only caution that I will add is just that if you're working with a very large organization, you may want to, once you start getting into your organizational analysis paper, you may want to narrow it down into a department or a division or unit within that organization, because sometimes large organizations, there are a lot of different cultures and a lot of different approaches in one given large organization. So sometimes it's good to narrow it down, but I'll leave that up to you and you'll kind of get a sense of that as you're working on your analysis, whether or not narrowing the focus down to a unit or department would make sense for your specific situation. But overall, I thought all of the organizations should work very well. Also, I thought the responses were exactly what I was anticipating, exactly what I was looking for. So the approach that you used in responding to Canvas essay number 1, you can go ahead and use that same approach as you respond to Canvas essay number 2 that is due next week. In Canvas essay number 2, we're going to draw upon some of the information that we talked about in class last week, where we discussed some of the differences between public and private organizations and how some of those differences are important for the way in which we study those organizations. And so for Canvas essay number 2, you'll be selecting a public and a private sector organization, and then just discussing 2 similarities and 2 differences between those 2 different types of organizations. And obviously, for the public organization, you can go ahead and use the organization that you're going to be using for your organizational analysis paper. And with everything else in this class, those discussion board posts are all meant to help you think through some of the aspects of the organizational analysis paper and to help you build that organizational analysis paper over the next several weeks. So feel free to use the same organization. So that's where we are right now in the class. Last week, in addition to introducing the course and the requirements, we then talked about what organization theory is. We talked about some of the different ways in which we can study organizations, a macro, a micro, and management type of orientation. We also did a foreshadowing of some of the theories and schools of thought that we will be covering during our very short term together this summer. We talked about differences between public and private organizations. And then I also introduced you to the approach that we're going to be using in order to try and tie all these theories and schools of thought together, the 4 models of organizational effectiveness, the mechanisms for coordination and control, and then the methods for motivating employees. And as I told you last week, every time we finish talking about a theorist or a school of thought, we'll then return to those 3 aspects and we'll talk about that theory, that school of thought, in relation to models of organizational effectiveness, methods of coordination and control, and methods for motivating employees. And so it's just a really good way we can kind of connect and tie everything together, because we will be talking about a lot of theories over the next few weeks. And so it's nice that we can see that connective tissue that kind of ties all those theories together. And in some ways, also some of the differences between those theories. Because as I also told you last week, in the development of the organization theory literature, the creation of these new theories, these new school of thoughts, they were created oftentimes to try and address problems and weaknesses with existing schools. And so as we go through our evolution, which we're going to start talking about tonight, you'll see how new schools popped up as rejoinders to some of the flaws in the established schools. So that's where we are at. And so tonight, what I have on the agenda is to begin our discussion of the development of organization theory literature. We always start with classic organization theory. And whenever I talk about the classical school of organization theory, I look at people like Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, Henri Fayol, James Mooney, Luther Gulick. Those are usually the primary authors I think about when we talk about the classic school of organization theory. Some of those authors, some of those theories you have been introduced to before in your 500 course. If you had 500 with me, I know for sure you've been introduced to at least a few of those folks. But we'll talk about classic organization theory. We'll talk about its advantages, disadvantages, and then we'll, hold on, I think we've got some reverb going here. Okay. We'll talk about those different theories in classic organization theory, and then we'll also link those up then to our models of organizational effectiveness and all that good stuff that we'll do with every single one of our theories. All right. Are there any questions or anything at all before we get going for the evening? If not, then let's jump into the classical school of organization theory. And where I always start this is with our good friend Max Weber. And you probably talked about Max Weber before in PPA 500. Max Weber comes at the idea of organizations from outside the world of public administration. And if you look at when Max Weber was doing most of his writing was being done in the late 1800s, and we didn't even have Woodrow Wilson's study of administration until 1887. So there really wasn't what we consider to be a discipline of public administration when Max Weber was doing his writing. So Max Weber, a lot of his educational background was in the world of sociology. He looked when he did look at organizations, he looked at German organizations because he was a German sociologist. So it's an example of a theory that comes to us from outside of public administration that we have then taken and used and applied to public organizations. Max Weber, in all of his theories, was a very big believer in empiricism. And when we talk about empiricism, we're talking about basing our decisions not on belief or faith, but rather basing our decisions on empirical evidence. And by empirical evidence, we mean tangible evidence. We're talking about evidence that can be collected, that can be analyzed, and then can be used to render decisions. So he really wanted to replace belief and faith with this empirical type of an approach to how we can study organizations. This empirical approach was very much predicated upon laws, rules, and regulations. He felt that for organizations to be effective, they had to have these rules, these regulations, and these policies and these procedures, and they had to document all those rules and policies and procedures. And then those rules and policies would then guide and dictate the actions and behaviors of that organization. Well, whenever you are basing your decisions on collecting information and analyzing that information, you are engaging in rational thought process. And Weber really believed that a bureaucratic organization was what he considered to be the highest level of rationality. So he really wanted these decisions made on a legal, rational basis as opposed to a faith or belief type of basis. So Weber believed that in organizations, because you have all these rules and regulations and all this empirical information, that authority will flow out of that empiricism, that authority will flow out of that empirical information. And so he presents us with what he calls three different types of authority: charismatic authority, traditional authority, and legal rational authority. And obviously, as we've already said before, he kind of buried the lead on this one. The type of authority that he really believed in was the third one, legal rational basis of authority. So, with these three systems of authority, charismatic, traditional, and legal rational, he says that these three types of authority will then breed and spawn administrative systems. So, if an organization is based upon charismatic authority, its administrative system will be charismatic administration. Charismatic administrative systems are predicated upon oftentimes the characteristics, the charisma of the leader themselves. So when you have a charismatic type of leader and you have charismatic administration, the good thing about having charismatic administration is that it engenders a lot of loyalty among followers. So if followers are following someone based upon their charisma, based upon their characteristics and their qualities, that is going to create a lot of loyalty among those followers. And that's a primary advantage of charismatic administration. The downside, obviously, of charismatic leadership and charismatic administration is that the authority structure tends to be relatively transient. It tends to be relatively temporary because the authority resides in the person, in the leader themselves, as opposed to residing in the office. So when formal authority is in the person and not the office, if that person leaves the organization, they will take their authority with them when they leave the organization. If authority is based in the office itself, as you have with bureaucratic administration, then it becomes much more permanent. And even if people leave the organization, the power authority basis still resides within that organization. In terms of charismatic leadership, charismatic administration, people oftentimes follow charismatic leaders for a couple of different reasons. And the literature tells us one of the reasons why people will follow a charismatic leader is because of what's called attribution theory. In attribution theory, someone follows a charismatic leader because that charismatic leader is demonstrating and exhibiting characteristics that that follower associates with good, strong leadership. So, for instance, a leader who makes decisions that are different than the status quo, leaders who are willing to make decisions in a different way than the organization's always made those decisions, followers will look at that as that is a quality, that's a characteristic that's associated with strong leadership, and they will attribute that practice to strong leadership and therefore follow that leader because of those characteristics and because of that willingness to do things a little bit differently. That's what's known as attribution theory to charismatic leadership. People will follow leaders that they attribute strong leadership to. Then the second theory of charismatic leadership is what's called self-concept theory. Self-concept theory says that people will follow charismatic leaders who they identify with. And so if they kind of see themselves in this leader and they think this leader kind of represents them and they can see themselves in this leader, they're going to be much more inclined to follow that leader under that self-concept type of a theory. But either way, whether it's through attribution or self-concept, charismatic administration tends to be inherently unstable because, again, the authority resides with the person rather than residing with the formal office. Then he said the second type of structure is what's known as traditional authority structures. Traditional authority structures are what we saw many, many years ago with things such as, royal families and the divine right of kings, where you had an individual who oftentimes would rule a jurisdiction. And the reason why they would rule that jurisdiction is because that's the way in which it was always done. They come from the royal family. A member of that royal family's always been in charge of this area, and so they always will be in charge of this area. It's a traditional type of authority. In traditional type of authority, that can spawn three different types of administrative systems. It can spawn what's called patriarchal administration, patrimonial administration, or feudal administration. The patriarchal administrative type of system is one that is based upon internal governance. This is one in which the leader leads and really doesn't seek out a lot of help from others. It's kind of this divine right of kings. This person has the divine right to rule. And so they'll keep administration basically to themselves, maybe some very close relatives, very close nuclear family members, but for the most part, it's a very centralized type of leadership. Patrimonial administration is when you start to extend the governance beyond the nuclear family. And so this is where the leader starts to rely upon uncles and starts relying upon cousins and people outside the nuclear family in order to administer this system. So it becomes a little bit more decentralized in terms of power. Then, if you're a student of history, you know that especially in Europe, there's a lot of feudal systems. Feudal administration is the third type of traditional authority. And in a feudal administrative system, now we are extending leadership beyond the nuclear family, beyond extended family, and now governance and leadership is being done by political allies. Those political allies are doing the bidding of the leader because the leader is able to incentivize them by providing them with land, providing them with titles of nobility, and by providing them with those incentives, that they can then keep these political allies in line and can dictate what these political allies do in governing this jurisdiction. So feudal administration is certainly far more decentralized than patrimonial. Patrimonial is more decentralized than patriarchal administration. But Weber kind of eschews both traditional as well as charismatic authority, and he really focuses on this idea of legal rational authority. And it says in a legal rational authority type of an approach, that will then breed the bureaucratic administrative system. In the bureaucratic administrative system, administration is done by a technical administrator. Administrator is being done by someone who has the knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to carry out these tasks. And he really felt that that was the most effective and the most efficient type of administrative system, hence the reason why we needed to embody that within our organizations. So our organizations are going to be staffed by these experts, by these professionals who have the knowledge, skills, and abilities to do the job. So in bureaucratic administration, you don't have that traditional approach. Well, this person came from this family, or this person graduated from this school, or anything like that. You look at the person's knowledge, skills, and abilities. Very similar to our career civil service system that we borrowed from England in the 1800s and then applied to our federal bureaucracy. We did not, if you remember from your 500 class, when you talked about Woodrow Wilson and the study of administration, you probably remember that here in the US, we did not create bureaucratic administration. We did not create a career civil service system. We borrowed it from England, brought it over to the US, and then we tweaked it, if you will. We modified it to make it fit our more open type of political culture. So things such as examinations to test for knowledge, skills, and abilities. We borrowed that idea from England and applied it to our career civil service system. The idea of allowing people to enter into the bureaucracy from the private sector. is something we borrow from England, modified it a little bit so that people could laterally enter from the private sector into the public sector, but that also then became part of our career civil service system. So Weber really did believe in this idea of career civil service. He was writing it about the same time as the 1883 Pendleton Act, which brought career civil service into the federal bureaucracy. So there's very much of an alignment there in terms of this faith in the technical expertise of these professional bureaucrats. So he really believes in legal, rational authority and this bureaucratic administrative system. So the theory of Weber that is most important for us in our discussion of classic organization theory is this idea of the ideal bureaucracy, the ideal bureaucratic organization. So Max Weber tells us that in order to be effective, and at the end of the day, what we are looking at when we study organizations is we are oftentimes looking to try and make those organizations more effective. The path to making an organization effective will differ depending upon the school of thought and the theorists that we are talking about. But for Max Weber, the path to organizational effectiveness and organizational efficiency is by making our organizations into these ideal bureaucratic organizations. And for Weber, an ideal bureaucratic organization is one that is built upon the concepts you see on the screen. Division of labor. We divide up the work within the organization. That makes us more efficient. When we divide the work up in the organization, everyone gets their own jobs, everyone gets their own tasks. That means that people will specialize in certain specific tasks on a daily basis. When they specialize in those specific tasks on a daily basis, they will then become experts in how to do those tasks because they are doing it day in and day out. He also argues an ideal bureaucratic organization, there is a structure to the organization that is based upon rules and policies and procedures. He really talks about this tall hierarchical structure, which is that pyramidal shape that you're all very familiar with as students of public administration, where you have one person at the apex of the pyramid, one person at the top of the organization structure. Then as you move down the organization structure, the pyramid widens out and you start encountering more and more people, more and more positions until you get to the bottom of the pyramid. And that's where the plurality of employees reside, is at the bottom of that pyramid. In that tall hierarchical type of pyramid shape in your organization structure, within that, you then have what he refers to as span of control and unity of command, two more principles of the ideal bureaucratic structure. Span of control means that everyone in the organization has a limited amount of people under them that they are responsible for. So you're not responsible necessarily for every single person who resides below you in the organization structure, but rather you may be directly responsible for 7 people or 10 people or 15 people, but we are going to limit your span of control as a leader so that you can better allocate your resources to manage that limited number of people. So again, very much of a rhyme and reason to how the organization is structured. Then there's also this thing he refers to as unity of command, in that everyone knows to whom they are accountable. So you know who your supervisor is, your supervisor knows who their supervisor is, and so on, up this tall hierarchical organization structure. As we said before, because this is based upon empiricism, what the organization does and how it behaves is based upon rules and policies and regulations. So the organization is very much a rule-bound organization. That idea of focusing on rules and procedures and policies is something that we'll see gets us into a little bit of trouble later on when we talk about some other authors such as Robert Merton and his idea that once you focus too much on rules and regulations, you kind of lose sight of the forest for the trees, in that you lose sight of serving your consumers, serving your citizens, and providing the types of products and services and programs that your consumers need. And instead, your goal becomes just focusing on adhering to those rules and those processes. But we'll talk about some of those criticisms a little bit later on when we talk about things like systems theory. These administrators who are experts are also professional administrators. They are there for a career. They are professionals who have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities in order to do these jobs. We will see later on in some of the theories that we talk about that in some of our public organizations, this idea of professional administrators can be kind of challenging in that you have people in organizations from different professions. Those different professions can have different codes of conduct and different ethical principles. And so sometimes those codes of conduct for different professions can come into conflict with each other and make for a confusing situation for administrators when they try to remain ethical administrators. But they're there for a career, they are these professionals, and all these rules and regulations are written down. Everything is based upon written documentation. Written documentation was important for Weber because when you have this written documentation, when you have these written rules and regulations, you can then adhere to these rules and regulations and apply them equally to everyone you come into contact with. So it helps to preclude from treating people in an arbitrary and capricious manner because you are applying the rules. And so everyone gets the same rules applied to them. So in a way, it's kind of a way in which we can protect individual rights. And you know from your earlier studies in the MPA program, or if you're not in the MPA program, some of the major values that underpin public administration are things like effectiveness and efficiency and the protection of individual rights and social equity and social justice, political responsiveness, representative bureaucracy. But one of those values is obviously the protection of individual rights. And so this will help you protect individual rights by adhering to these written rules and these written procedures. So Max Weber is telling us here is a panacea. Here is a one-size-fits-all approach that can be applied across all your organizations. And if you can structure your organizations in this one-size-fits-all approach, then you can have an effective and an efficient organization. That is one of the threads that kind of ties all these classical theorists together, in that they all postulate that they can come up with the one magic bullet. They can come up with the one theory, whatever that theory is, that should apply in all organizations to make all those organizations effective and efficient. As we move through our discussion of the evolution of organization theory literature, we will see that more modern theorists reject that notion. And more modern theorists will make the argument that no, it's a much more contextual type of decision-making process. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach that applies to every single organization. As we talked about last week, there are a lot of differences between public organizations in terms of their functions and their size and their technologies and their staffing. And so it's hard to find that one-size-fits-all approach. But Weber, as a good classical theorist, really felt this was his one-size-fits-all. So this ideal bureaucratic structure, structuring your organization in this ideal bureaucratic way, according to Weber, would make your organization effective. Now, the models of organizational effectiveness that Weber emphasizes are clearly the ones that are predicated upon control. Weber, through this very structured power type of situation in the organization, this top-down hierarchical type of system, really emphasized control over the work of the organization. So it's not surprising to us that the two models of organizational effectiveness emphasized by Max Weber are internal process model and the rational goal model, because again, they're at the bottom of our Quinn and Rohrbach matrix. They are emphasizing control. Now, the internal process approach is very clear to us because we're looking at how people relate within the organization in terms of this organizational structure. So it makes sense that it's internal. But the goal of effectiveness kind of falls more into that rational goal model and kind of leads us a little bit external to the organization. But the commonality here is the focus is on control. And the better we can control aspects of the organization, the better we can make that organization more effective. So how do we go about controlling the activities within the organization under Max Weber and his ideal bureaucracy? Well, clearly, we're going to emphasize direct supervision. There's not a whole lot of flexibility that's afforded to employees in these very stringent ideal bureaucracies. There's a lot of direct supervision, a lot of top-down command and control, as well as a standardization. So standardization of work processes, as well as standardization of worker skills. So very centralized, top-down standardization, direct supervision. In terms of motivating strategies, the motivating strategies are also relatively strict in that the primary strategy is legal compliance. You hold people in compliance with these rules and these regulations. So there's not a lot of consideration for the employees in terms of their wants and needs. It's much more, here are the rules, here are the processes. You need to follow these rules and processes. If you fail to follow these rules and processes, then obviously you'll be removed from the organization. And that's just a nice way of saying you will be fired from the organization. So the problem with Weber and ideal bureaucracy, as you know by now, is that it was a very dehumanizing approach. It really didn't provide a lot of faith in the skills and the intelligence of individual employees. Individual employees were kind of these just parts of the organization's machinery. And if they don't work out in the organization, they can be removed and then replaced with other individuals. So it was a very dehumanizing approach that really didn't shed much light on how to motivate employees beyond just holding them to accord with these laws and these rules and these regulations. So that's Max Weber in his ideal bureaucratic theory. Now, even though we have said that there are a lot of flaws in terms of being dehumanizing and not affording a lot of flexibility to individual employees, we also then have to recognize that there's a lot of Max Weber in our modern day public organizations. In your organization, you probably see an organization chart and you know where you are in that organization chart. You probably supervise some employees and you probably have a supervisor who supervises your work as well. That's your span of control. That's your unity of command. I'm sure you have policy and procedure manuals. Those are also artifacts of Max Weber. So even though Max Weber in his ideal bureaucratic theories fallen into some disfavor throughout the evolution of the organization theory literature, the basic precepts of it are still found within our modern organizations. Then the second classical theorist that we talked about in this class that you probably already talked about in PPA 500, but we'll put a little bit more flesh on the bones, is Frederick Taylor and Frederick Taylor's theory of scientific management. Taylor believed that we could study organizations and we could study the work processes within organizations in order to try and figure out the one best way to do these jobs. And we can do it in a very scientific type of manner. Taylor, when he was writing primarily in the early 1900s. Taylor looked around at our essentially factory system because, you know, we're at that point in time, we're in the Industrial Revolution, the tail end, and we're seeing the creation of all these factories and all these industries. And he's looking around at these organizations and he's saying, you know, there's not a whole lot of science of management. There's not a whole lot of management, period, going on with these organizations. One of the problems that he identified is that we didn't have a system of middle managers. We essentially had leaders in the organization, and then we had workers doing the daily work, the daily tasks of the organization. We didn't have a whole lot of middle management to bridge the gap between leaders and line workers. And so he felt that we needed to come up with some science of management so that we can have some managers there who knew how to lead and direct the work of workers. The lack of middle managers meant that there is very little supervision and guidance being provided to workers in how to do the jobs. And so you didn't have a lot of feedback coming to them in terms of, well, you're not being efficient in this manner or this manner. So we needed to provide some more of that feedback, some more of that supervision and guidance. And he looked around a lot of these organizations and saw, again, a lot of labor unrest. You think about things like The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair, documenting some of these horrific environments in which people were working in, and then the resulting labor unrest that was occurring because of these deplorable conditions. And he decided we needed to come up with a science of management to help us become more effective and, most notably, to become more efficient as well. So he develops this idea of scientific management, which you have learned about before. The hope of Frederick Taylor was that scientific management, coming up with the science of management, could help us eliminate what he called soldiering in organizations. What he saw in a lot of organizations is people were just doing as little as possible to get by. So they weren't working hard, putting forth a lot of effort in order to try and excel and reach higher performance levels. They were just doing the very minimum that they had to do in order to get by and keep their jobs on a daily basis. He referred to that as the process of soldiering. He felt if we could create new standards for performance and then tell these employees, here are the standards for performance, and hold them accountable to those new standards, we could get away from this soldiering type of activity. He also saw a situation where people were being hired into the jobs that did not have the requisite knowledge, skills, and abilities for those jobs. He argued we needed to hire the quote unquote right employee for a job. If you bring in someone who doesn't have the abilities to do a job, obviously they are not going to be successful. He wanted to establish standards that will systematize the production process. So here is a primary difference between Taylor and Weber. Weber wanted to achieve organizational efficiency and effectiveness primarily through organization structure. Taylor wanted to achieve organizational efficiency and effectiveness through work processes, focusing on the work process, standardizing and systematizing the work process, systematizing the tools that are used in that work process, essentially coming up with what I refer to as the one best way to do every job within our organization. So he looked at the work process, whereas Weber looked at the structure of the organization. So the way in which we would engage in scientific management is by using the strategy known as time motion studies. So he would have a performance analyst, if you will, who would stand there with a stopwatch and would stand there and watch the employee do every single aspect of the job, would time every single motion, every movement taken by that employee. The goal was to get rid of all the inefficient movements. He referred to those inefficient movements as false movements. So you get rid of all the false movements, and then the efficient movements, the movements that led to higher levels of performance and productivity, those true movements, you would then combine together into this one best way to do the job. One of the basic jobs that he looked at was a very simple job of shoveling pig ore. And so was position himself behind an employee, would time how much time it took the employee to pick the shovel up, to put the shovel into the cart of pig ore or the pile of pig ore, how much time it took them to pick the shovel full up, how much time it took them to take the shovel full over to a cart, how much time it took them to dump it into the cart, then how much time it took them to go back to the pile and to begin the process again. So we would deconstruct the job into its component elements so that we could find the one best way to do the job. We would then hire people who had the skills to do the job in that one best way. We would then monitor their performance to make sure they're doing the job in the one best way. We would then reward them for their performance. And so if they're doing the job in the one best way, they would be rewarded with merit pay. If they were not doing the job in the one best way, they would then be removed from that position, removed from the organization, and then replaced with someone who could do the job in that one best way. Taylor also believed, because we had this absence of middle managers, he wanted to create a situation where managers were located closer to the work, closer to the employees, and that managers were also trained in the one best way to do the job. So managers also had this task specialization as well as employees having this task specialization. Because obviously, how could they hold employees accountable for achieving a performance level if they didn't understand the job and how the job should be done? So that was his idea of scientific management. Now, scientific management really began in the private sector. Again, Frederick Taylor comes at this from outside of the world of public administration, much more in the world of business management and private sector management. So he saw scientific management begin to be implemented across the private sector. And then we saw it start to move into the public sector. So in the 1920s, we really kind of hit the heyday of scientific management. This is where we see it in a lot of our private organizations and then starting to seep over into the public sector. The criticisms associated with scientific management were somewhat similar to the criticisms associated with Max Weber. Things such as dehumanization of employees. In some of his writings, Frederick Taylor referred to employees as being quote unquote boorish beasts. You're referring to someone as a boorish beast. Obviously, you don't have a whole lot of faith in them as human beings. You don't have a lot of faith in their intellectual capacity, in their ability to be creative, innovative, and do critical thinking. He referred to employees also as being merely cogs in the machinery. So, like in a machine, you've got all these cogs, and there are teeth in all the cogs. If one of the teeth breaks off of a cog, then the cogs will not be able to make contact with each other, and the machine will grind to a halt. So you get that cog that has the broken tooth, you pull it out, you throw it away, and you replace it with a new cog. So individual employees did not have any inherent value in and of themselves. The only value they had is what they can contribute to doing this job in the one best way. And if all the jobs are being done in that one best way, then that is what will make the organization productive. That will make the organization effective as well as efficient in nature. So these flaws with scientific management, the dehumanizing of people, these flaws are really important because these are the flaws that human relations theorists will capitalize on a couple of decades later in criticizing scientific management and then using those criticisms as a springboard to the creation of a new school of thought known as human relations theory and human resource management theory. So it's important because these flaws really provide the genesis for these newer, more modern schools of thought. So kind of the seeds of its destruction were already embedded within scientific management. So in terms of scientific management and these models of organizational effectiveness, it looks very much like Max Weber. Emphasizes internal process, emphasizes rational goal. The goal is obviously for the organization to be effective and efficient, and the internal process model is clearly probably the strongest model that's emphasized because we are looking directly at those work processes that go on within the organization. In terms of the mechanisms for coordination and control, we have essentially standardization. Now, I do think there's a lot of direct supervision there as well. So I might part company with Tompkins. Tompkins doesn't really highlight direct supervision. I think there is a good component of direct supervision here, but there's a lot of standardization. There's standardization, obviously, of work processes and coming up with the one best way to do a job. There's standardization of the work outputs that if you standardize the process, then the outputs will have the quality that you are looking for. I personally would also emphasize standardization of worker skills because he talked a lot about finding people who have the quote unquote right skills in order to do the job and hiring those people with the right skills. But a lot of standardization in the work process. In terms of the motivational strategies, certainly legal compliance. Here is the one best way to do the job. You will be monitored and then held accountable for doing that job in that one best way. And then rewards for performance. If you do that job in the one best way, then you will receive this bonus pay, this merit pay. So pay for performance was actually one of those innovations that came out of Frederick Taylor in scientific management. But again, the seeds for the destruction of scientific management really laid within the idea of dehumanizing employees and not really taking into account the wants and the needs of individual employees. The goal here is very much the macro level goal, organizational efficiency and effectiveness, irrespective of the goals of individual employees. Now, despite those flaws, and despite the fact that those flaws were glaring enough to lead to the development of new and different theories and schools of thought, we also, just like with Weber, need to recognize that scientific management is still alive and well in our organizations. You probably have a position description for your position. And that position description will describe for you the types of tasks that you are to be doing on a daily basis. It will probably describe the percentage of time that should be devoted to those tasks. That position description can only be written if you have already done a job analysis. A job analysis, as done by most modern day organizations, is an analysis of each individual position to deconstruct those positions into their component elements. So very much like scientific management, we're going to break those jobs up into here are all the different parts of the job, and that's how we analyze each individual position through a job analysis. We'll then take the results of each one of those job analyses, and we will then use those results to engage in what's called job evaluation. And job evaluation is when we'll take the results of the analysis and then we'll be able to compare our positions to each other for the purpose of putting them in a position classification system and then assigning compensation. So our career civil service system, our position classification system, that is all kind of based upon this idea of scientific management from Frederick Taylor. Your position, if you work for, especially if you work at the federal level or the state level, probably at the local level as well for most local governments, your position will have a classification. It will fit into a what we call a step and columns type of classification system, and it will have a pay grade. And based upon your pay grade, that will then determine your compensation. So for positions that require a lot more supervision, require a lot more education and training, those positions will be ranked higher in the classification system and will then have a higher pay grade, a higher pay band, and will then be compensated more than positions that don't have the same types of supervisory requirements. So the example that I always use in 500 with a job evaluation is an example of comparing a position of a police chief to a patrol officer. So in doing the job evaluation, you would look at for the police chief probably has or certainly does have a lot more supervisory requirements than a patrol officer, has requirements for managing budgets and managing finances, has a lot more responsibility in terms of public relations and interfacing with the public. Those are all ranked higher for a police chief than they would be for a patrol officer. However, where the patrol officer ranks higher will probably be in things such as the threat to safety. And so it's a much more dangerous job to be out there and be a patrol officer as opposed to being the police chief in charge of the police department. And so what you'll do, and you'll weight each one of those things in terms of supervisory requirements, threat to personal safety. You'll weight those in terms of importance, and then you'll come up with a summary score for each one of those positions. And then those positions that are ranked the highest, then get paid the most in compensation. Hence the reason why the police chief position is at the top of the position classification system and makes a great deal more in terms of compensation than the base salary of a patrol officer. So we see scientific management alive and well in our organizations today, even in our modern day organizations. So again, when we're looking at scientific management, the similarity to Weber is that, again, it's looking for that one size fits all approach. It's looking for that magic bullet, that panacea that can be applied across all of our organizations. Also, it shares the similar characteristic of focusing on the goal of the organization. We don't care about the individual employees. We are focusing on the macro level goals of the organization. Where they differ is in how they do it. So for Weber, it's a structure focus. For Taylor, it's much more really focused on work processes and coming up with that one best way to do every job within our organization. Then moving forward with this discussion of classic organization theorists, I also include in this classical school people like Henri Fail. And Henri Fail shares characteristics with Weber and Taylor in that he is again trying to come up with a one best way in order to make our organizations effective and efficient. And that's kind of that thread that ties all those classical theorists together. One of the interesting aspects of Henri Fail is that Fail tells us that yes, we should focus on how we manage organizations in order to make those organizations effective. But we have to look at it from a much more holistic perspective. We have to realize that managing an organization is just one aspect of how we govern our organizations. That management is just one part of organizational governance. So he viewed it much larger than Taylor or Weber would. He said, how should we best govern our organizations in order to make them as effective and efficient as possible? Fail argues that governing an organization consists of not just management, but it also consists of things like technical activities. And by technical activities, Fail is talking about the specific things that we do on a daily basis in our organization in the creation of the goods and services. So in creating our outputs that we create on a daily basis, we will engage in technical activities that will help us create those outputs. We also engage in commercial activities. Commercial activities speak to the exchange of resources between the organization and other organizations, or between the organizations and other segments of the economy. So that exchange, that transactional relationship, is what he considers to be commercial activities within an organization. So if you look at the private sector, it's very easy to see a commercial activity would be going out there and selling your product. That's a commercial type of activity. Financial activities. All organizations need to generate revenue so that they have the revenue in order to carry out their technical activities. So you need to manage your finances, how you're generating revenue, how much you're generating, where that revenue is coming from. Those are your financial types of activities. Security activities. How does the organization secure the intellectual property of that organization? How is it sure that another organization is not going to come along and steal its ideas and steal its intellectual property and steal its information? That's a huge activity in organizations today with the internet and with cyber threats and cyber hacking. How do you secure your information online? And then accounting activities. How do you make sure that money is being spent where money is supposed to be spent? If you've taken the budgeting course and you're very familiar with the approach to accounting used in the public sector, things like modified accrual accounting, things such as fund segregation, where you put money in different types of funds, depending upon where that money is coming from and how that money is being spent. General funds, special revenue funds, fiduciary funds, proprietary funds. Those are all those accounting activities to make sure that we have control over how we are spending all these financial resources. So management is just one of these many aspects of how we govern our organizations, again, in a much more holistic view than what we saw with Weber or what we saw with Taylor. Fayol argues that given that management is one of these different activities in the governance of the organization, he focused very much on management, and he wanted to really deconstruct this management activity, this management function, and kind of see what was going on in management and how we could best inform our leaders and managers how to effectively and efficiently manage your organizations. So he argued there are 5 essential functions of managing an organization: planning, organizing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. We need to plan our operations into the future. We need to organize all the units and people and all the functions going on within our organization. From a top-down type of perspective, leaders and managers need to command employees so they make sure the employees are doing what they are supposed to be doing. We have coordination because we have to coordinate all the different elements in our organization. And then we have to control our functions in order to make sure that we are meeting our goals and objectives as an organization. These functions then led Fayol to create all these different discrete principles of management. And that term principles is important because Fayol is oftentimes looked at as being one of what's called in the literature the principles theorists, in that he, along with people like Mooney and Gulick, who we'll talk about in a couple minutes, those 3 individuals all talked about identifying principles that leaders and managers could adhere to and learn in order to more effectively and efficiently manage their organizations. So for Fayol, his principle school, his principles of management are the ones that you see listed there on the screen for you. Some of them we're very familiar with because we heard them with Weber. Division of work, just like with Weber, we have to divide up the labor within the organization. Managers also need to delegate authority in a way in which it creates responsibility and accountability for employees. So if you can delegate some authority to employees, those employees will then feel accountable and responsible for those areas that have been delegated to them. And that is an efficient approach, if you will, an efficient function of principle of management. Discipline. Leaders and managers need to know how to discipline employees in order to make sure employees are doing what they need to be doing in order to meet the goals of the organization. Unity of command in the same way as we talked about it with Max Weber. Subordination to the general interest. That's important principle according to Fayol, that employees are willing to put general interests of the organization above their own individual private interests. So organizational general interest is more important than private interests. Remuneration, very similar to what we saw with Frederick Taylor, reward employees and pay employees for doing the job well. Centralization. Decisions are centralized at the top of the organizational chart, and those decisions are then passed down through the chain of command, very similar to what you saw with Max Weber. The establishment of order within the organization. When the organization is well ordered, everyone knows who is responsible for what, and all things then work much more fluidly and much more efficiently when you have a well-ordered organization. Equity, you need to treat people fairly so that if they see some people working a certain level, then they're going to want to be able to work that level as well. They see some people getting certain types of remuneration, certain types of rewards, then they're going to want to get that same remuneration, those same rewards. Stability of personnel, kind of similar to what Weber told us about having career professional employees. You need to have stable personnel. One of the primary issues that a lot of organizations run into today is lack of employee retention, high rates of employee turnover. And on occasion, I teach a class in managing public sector effectiveness. And I always ask students to identify for their paper assignment, one problem that their organization is facing. And then throughout the course, we then develop some possible solutions to that problem. And then they select the solution that is most appropriate and provide a justification for that solution. The problems that most people select or have selected in the past have been employee retention. And a lot of public organizations have trouble keeping a stable cadre of personnel. Obviously, if you have trouble keeping personnel, there are a lot of ancillary costs associated with that. If you have to go out there and hire new people, hiring is expensive. In the public sector, it's a protracted process that may take 6 or 9 months. Those positions may sit vacant until you get that new person onboarded. Onboarding is expensive. Training these employees are expensive. All of those ancillary costs mean that high rates of employee turnover can really be detrimental to an organization. So you need to keep a very stable personnel. Initiative. Initiative in terms of people need to be rewarded for taking initiative, that they shouldn't be penalized for trying something new. We should reward innovations. And then finally, this idea of an esprit de corps. Esprit de corps is essentially a feeling that we are all in this together, that everyone in the organization feels that we are in this together, we are working together to try and accomplish the goals of the organization. Now, one thing that you may notice with all of these principles of management that Fail talks about, some of these do link back to Max Weber, and so we're not surprised by them, but some of them are kind of psychological in nature. So things such as authority creating responsibility, that kind of plays on the psyche of an employee, that if an employee is made responsible for something, they will take on that responsibility, they will take on that accountability. The subordination to the general interest, again, kind of a psychological principle here, that people are more willing to put the organization's interests first and ahead of their own individual interests. Feelings of equity and fairness, again, kind of get at that psychological component. Initiative, rewarding people and trying to get people to be creative and be innovative. That again has a psychological component. And then certainly this esprit de corps, this feeling that we're all in it together in the organization, again, predicated upon a psychological focus. So one of the important things to recognize, we'll talk about in a second with Fail, is he really focused a lot more on the psychological than either Weber or Taylor or even some of the others we'll talk about tonight, like Mooney and Gulick. He really kind of focused more on psychology. How do you implement these different principles that we've talked about? Well, you have to survey your organization. You have to see where your organization is lacking. Today, we would talk about doing a SWOT or a SWOT analysis. If you've done one of those in your organization, you know in a SWOT analysis, you're identifying the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats or challenges, whether you like SWOT or SWOC, in order to kind of get a sense of what are the needs of the organization. Once you identify those needs, you may find out that one of the needs of the organization is we're not rewarding initiative enough. You might find out that there's not enough order in the organization. You might find out that people don't have this esprit de corps. They don't have this feeling that they're all in this together. You can then come up with a plan to try and address those principles that need to be addressed. Report your success in achieving those principles. And then just like Max Weber, everything again gets written down. So you have a record of these principles. You have a record of your needs analysis in terms of what you need to do in order to achieve these principles. But again, with Fail, we're looking more at the psychological factors, but we're not looking at psychological factors for the benefit of the employee. We're looking at psychological factors for the benefit of the organization. So how can we play upon these psychological factors with our employees to then induce our employees to provide more higher performance levels, more productivity, to help make the organization more efficient and more effective? Fail was not the only one who tried to identify these principles that could be applied across all of our organizations to make them more effective. You also have someone like James Mooney. And Mooney, who took Fail's work and kind of built upon it, As opposed to Fail, Moody's principles approach focused much more on the structure of the organization, whereas Fail focused a little bit more on psychological factors. And so with Mooney, looking at the structure of the organization, it's kind of a callback to Max Weber, because that was Max Weber's primary focus with his ideal bureaucracy. According to Mooney, there are three primary principles that we need to adhere to in our organizations: the coordinative principle, the scalar chain principle, and the functional principle. The coordinative principle is very similar to what Fail told us about the need to coordinate and control the work within our organizations. So he got that directly from Fail. The scalar chain principle he got directly from Max Weber, and Weber's structural focus of having this unity of command, having this span of control, and this organizational structure where everyone knows to whom they are accountable. But it's really this third principle that stands out to us from Mooney. And this is what Mooney is best known for, and it's the functional principle. In the functional principle, what Mooney tells us is essentially not all positions in an organization are the same. Not every position in the organization is equal. Different positions in our organizations have different functions. And he identifies two different types of positions that have different functions: line employees versus staff employees. Line employees, according to Mooney, are those employees who are interfacing with the public. These are people who are delivering these goods and services and programs to members of the public on a daily basis. These are what Michael Lipsky calls our street level bureaucrats. They're down at the street level. They're working directly with citizens. They're delivering these programs and these services directly to the citizens. Those are your line employees. Then a second type of employee is what he calls a staff employee. A staff employee is the employee that provides the resources to make the work of the line employee possible. So in order for that line employee to be out there on a daily basis interfacing with citizens, there are resources that are needed. Those resources are things such as they got to get paid, they got to get their benefits, they have to have supplies in order to do this. They may need, a vehicle that they have to drive in. They may need gasoline in that vehicle. These are all supports that are provided to those line employees by those staff employees. Well, so what? That seems pretty commonsensical for us today. Why was that important? That was important because really for the first time with Mooney, we start to see a differentiation between different types of employees within our organization. For Weber and for Taylor, and also to somewhat degree with Fail, we looked at employees as kind of being interchangeable. They were kind of just nameless, faceless. What applied to one employee applied to all employees. Now Mooney is telling us, no, there are different types of positions in our organization. So therefore, we need to manage those positions differently. Line employees will need different type of support than staff employees may need. So it starts to add a little bit more nuance into our understanding of the different types of employees and different types of positions within our organizations. But when you're talking about principles, the person who really stands out to us is our good friend Luther Gulick. And you've been introduced, if you're in the MPA program, you were introduced to Luther Gulick back in the 500 course. Luther Gulick now is really our first author who really did a lot of work in the field of public administration. He's one who not only focused on public organizations, but took his theories, took his principal school, and applied it directly to the federal bureaucracy. Luther Gulick was a member of the Brownlow Commission. And if you remember any of your history of the federal bureaucracy, the Brownlow Commission was a commission that was established in the wake of FDR and his New Deal in order to reorganize the federal bureaucracy to make it easier for the president to manage. In the New Deal and the response to the Great Depression, the New Deal programs were predicated upon the creation of all these new agencies to implement all these new programs, what came to be known as the alphabet agencies. So you got all these agencies that kind of went by their three-letter acronyms, a great expansion in the size of the federal government. By expanding the federal government to that extent, it made it more difficult for one singular president to be able to efficiently and effectively manage this ever increasing bureaucracy. So the Brownlow Commission was created in order to come up with some strategies in order to reorganize the bureaucracy to make it easier for the president to manage. Some of the things that came out of the Brownlow Commission, the creation of this thing called the Executive Office of the President, or the EOP, which is still with us today. The Executive Office of the President was meant to be kind of an umbrella agency in which all the management agencies, so what we call the overhead agencies, would then be located within. And so if you're an agency that is responsible for helping the president manage the bureaucracy, you would then be relocated into this executive office of the president to locate you closer to the president, locate you closer to the White House, so that you are more directly connected to the president. But some of the other changes that were brought into the federal bureaucracy came straight from a lot of Gulick's theories and his principal school of management. Gulick, in his principal school of management, again, taking kind of this one-size-fits-all approach, says that every organization and every manager in every organization needs to understand and adhere to these following principles: planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. These are all principles or functions that every single manager does in every single organization. So all managers have to plan. They have to strategically plan the operations of their organization and what the organization will be doing in the future in order to try and achieve its goals. They have to establish goals. They have to establish mission statements. That's all part of this planning type of principle. So managers need to know how to strategically plan their organizations. All managers need to engage in organizing. They have to organize the people within their organizations, the positions, the work within the organization. So all managers have to engage in organizing. All managers need to engage in staffing. You need to bring in a well-qualified, competent labor pool into your organization. So we all engage in this staffing function or staffing principle. Directing. All leaders and managers need to direct the activities of the employees underneath them. Coordinating. All leaders and managers need to coordinate the work going on within their organization. Very similar again to Henri Fayol. They all have to engage in reporting. We have to report upon what we are doing, the outputs that we are creating, how we are spending our money, produce those outputs so that we can hold people and the organization accountable. Again, kind of similar again, back to Henri Fayol. And then finally, budgeting. We all have to engage in bringing in resources, managing those resources, creating budgets, managing budgets, accounting for those budgets, a basic principle, a basic function of management. The idea here for Luther Gulick is that these are the basic principles that all managers need to do. So they're essentially tools in a managerial toolkit. So if we can teach all of our managers how to do these different principles, they then have this managerial toolkit. So facing a certain type of situation, they can then reach into that toolkit. They can pull out one of those tools and apply it in an appropriate situation. So they can pull out their planning tool. They can pull out their staffing tool. They can pull out their budgeting tool. This is, again, a one-size-fits-all approach because we're saying here is the universe of principles that our managers need to understand. And by understanding these principles, this is what will make our managers and therefore our organizations effective. Now, not everyone bought into this principles approach of Gulick, and there are two very prominent public administration scholars who had major problems with Gulick's principal school. One of them is Herb Simon, and we talk about Herb Simon in a lot of different contexts in public administration courses. Herb Simon is very well known as a theorist who, while he did develop his own theories, he was also well known for criticizing the theories of others. And so Simon criticized things like, rational comprehensive decision making, and he criticized the use of incentives. Here he's criticizing the principal school. And he, in a very pejorative way, kind of describes these principles as being more like proverbs. And he said, just like any proverb, you can always find a countervailing, you can always find an opposite proverb to any proverb that you want. The proverbs oftentimes end up conflicting with each other and being kind of self-contradictory. Well, he said these principles are not really principles, they're more like proverbs, and you can always, one of those principles can cancel out another. And so if you're saying, well, you should be planning right now, well, shouldn't you also be budgeting? Shouldn't you also be reporting? Shouldn't you also be staffing? And he's basically making the argument these are not mutually exclusive in the way in which Gulick may have led us to believe. And then another author who had some major problems with Gulick's principal school was Dwight Waldo. And Dwight Waldo made the argument these principles are not really principles, but instead they're prescriptions. He says Gulick is basically telling us this is what we need to do in our organizations, but really had no scientific basis to back up his principles. Waldo argued that the principles were very much value laden, and the values that they emphasized were things like centralization and executive control. And there wasn't a whole lot of scientific basis for advocating for this much centralization, this much control within our organizations. But despite those criticisms, we did see some of the principal school make its way into some of the reforms in the federal bureaucracy as a result of the Brownlow Commission. So here, for the first time with Luther Gulick, we now have what we would consider to be a public administration scholar who's actually applying his theories directly to the world of public administration. So let's take a look at the principal school, Fayol, Mooney, and Gulick, as they reflect the models of organizational effectiveness. Since I put them in this classical school, one of the reasons I do that is that they all emphasize the same models of organizational effectiveness. Just like Weber, just like Taylor, these principles theorists also emphasize an internal process approach as well as a rational goal approach. There's not a whole lot of emphasis being paid to human relations, not a whole lot of emphasis being paid to the environment external to the organization. This is very much of a command and control type of orientation. Mechanisms for coordination and control, very much direct supervision, very much like Max Weber was and Frederick Taylor, very much direct supervision, very top-down type of an approach. If we can teach our leaders these principles, they can then apply them and implement them over their employees. So very centralizing type of executive control, as Dwight Waldo would call it. And then in terms of motivation, it's a relatively negative motivational strategy, legal compliance. So we hold people accountable to adhere to these principles. If they do not adhere to these principles, they will be held to account for failing to abide by these principles. And so because of this kind of dehumanizing lack of focus on individual employees, I think what we have done is we've kind of shown this thread that ties together all these classical theorists. And then the other thread that ties them together is also this idea that they were all looking for a one-size-fits-all approach. For the principles theorists, it was these discrete principles that we could teach our leaders and managers. For Frederick Taylor, it was the one-size-fits-all approach to our work processes. And then for Max Weber, it was the one ideal structure for our organizations. But despite all the criticisms that we have lodged against all these different authors, again, just like with Weber and Taylor, with these principles theorists, we still see these principles alive and well in our modern day organizations. But it's really that dehumanizing aspect in terms of how employees are treated that really led to a lot of consternation among theorists in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, and then led to the creation of some new schools of thought that challenged a lot of the assumptions in the classical school. So that kind of gets us started with our discussion of the evolution of literature in organization theory with our discussion of the classical school. Are there any questions or any observations or anything before we take a break tonight on any of these classical theorists, any of their theories, or kind of how they relate with each other, or any differences between our classical theorists? Any questions? Okay. If not, then let's go ahead and take a break at 7:20. So let's take about a 10-minute break. And when we come back from the break, I would like to work ahead a little bit because again, we only have 5 Zoom sessions and we're in number 2 already. So I want to make sure we're able to get through all of our information, still afford you time for the presentations on our last class session together. So we're going to work ahead a little bit when we come back from the break, and we're going to look at pre-human relations theory. I want to introduce you to Mary Parker Follett and kind of show you an example of a theory that was generated as a response to some of the criticisms that were associated with the classical school. And then if we have time remaining at the end of our discussion of Mary Parker Follett, I do have a breakout exercise that we can work on, but we'll kind of play it by ear and see how much time we have left, whether or not we will do that. I know I've talked past our 7:20, so let's just go ahead and say, let's come back at 7:35, give you enough time to get something to eat or something to drink. So when you come back at 7:35, I'll switch out our slides and we'll talk a bit about Mary Parker Follett, and then we'll see how we're doing on time. So I'll see you back here at 7:35. Okay, welcome back. We're back from our break, and I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera off. Just it's working well so far, so I don't want to tempt fate. So I'll just go ahead and stop my video. Um, like I said, what I'd like to do is now is kind of work ahead a little bit and create a segue, kind of bridge into human relations theory. Again, just kind of continuing this discussion and our story of the evolution of organization theory literature. And the person I want to introduce you to now is Mary Parker Follett. And Mary Parker Follett, you had me for 500. I talked about her in 500. Hopefully you've heard about her before in the program if you're in the MPA program, but Mary Parker Follett is viewed by Tompkins as being a pre-human relations theorist. And the reason why she's viewed as pre-human relations is because of the period of time in which she was writing. I kind of include her in human relations theory because a lot of the theories that she came up with were theories that were then developed 10, 20, 30 years later by other human relations theorists. So she was kind of at the cutting edge of a lot of this idea of human relations theory. But Mary Parker Follett was writing in the early 1900s, primarily in the 1920s. And at the period of time when Follett was writing, she was writing at the heyday of scientific management. And so at the same time in which scientific management was being adopted, not only in the private sector, but also in the public sector, now you have Mary Parker Follett stepping up and kind of being that lone voice in the wilderness, as I always say, who is willing to stand up and take issue with some of the problems that were associated with scientific management. And so just because she was writing so early on in the 1920s, I think that's the reason why some folks will refer to her as a pre-human relations theorist. The problem for Follett, obviously, is she was writing in the early 1900s as a female theorist. A lot of male counterparts, unfortunately, didn't pay attention to her theories. Some of the later HR theorists, like Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger, they didn't even know about a lot of the theories that were being developed by Follett at the time. So I think that's kind of why she's kind of a little divorced from human relations theory by some authors, but I think she really established a nice framework for us to understand human relations theory and how different human relations theory is from our more classical theorists like Weber, Taylor, and our principles authors. So Follett, the heyday of scientific management, had the courage to speak up and identify some of the problems, some of the flaws associated with scientific management. Things such as the dehumanizing nature, things such as an organization focus without a whole lot of concern for our individual employees. I think she was very, I don't know if mortified is a good word, but she was very concerned about Taylor's and Weber's language about individual employees as being boorish beasts and as being cogs in the machinery of government of organizations. So she really wanted to take issue with that. And that's important because, as I mentioned before, these new theories, these new school of thoughts just don't come out of the blue. They come about as reactions to a previous school and the problems associated with a previous school. One of the things I really like about Mary Parker Follett is the way in which she views organizations. She views organizations as being similar to a representative democracy. She talks a lot about creating democratic organizations and that we should manage and lead our organizations in a similar way as to how we lead a democratic society. She says we think about our organizations as democratic organizations. A democratic organization is probably going to suffer from the same fundamental flaws that a democratic society will suffer from. So she says in a democratic society, two of the fundamental flaws in democracy are particularized interests and passive citizens. Particularized interests are nothing new. It's not a discussion she created in the 1920s. As early as James Madison, he was telling us about particularized interests and what he referred to as factions back in Federalist Paper number 10. And when Madison talked to us about factions, he said that factions, particularized interests, are a natural outgrowth of a democracy. He said, anytime you have a democracy, you have an exchange of ideas. Whenever you have an exchange of ideas, there are going to be different people and different groups that have a different set of ideas as compared to others. And so one of the most effective ways to deal with those particularized interests is to balance one interest against another interest. In his Federalist Paper number 10, if you remember back to that, what Madison said is that there are two possible ways to deal with factions. One way is to eliminate them, but he says you cannot do that in a democracy because if you eliminate factions, you eliminate these particular interests, you eliminate democracy. So he says the most appropriate way to do it is to control their effects by balancing faction against faction. In order to balance faction against faction, it means that you have to have robust communication, you have to have robust dialogue so that people can share their ideas and share their perspectives. But that's a way in which you kind of balance these particularized interests. It's all about this compound republic that Madison talked about. That instead of having a compact republic, a very small government, a very small jurisdiction of homogeneous individuals, you instead have what he called a compound republic, where you have a lot of differences of opinion, you have a heterogeneous society, and then you allow those different interests to balance against each other. The second fundamental flaw in a democracy, according to Follett, is the passivity of citizens. And she says, when you think about how citizens participate in their own governance in a democracy, the primary way they participate is going to be through voting. There are a lot of ways you can participate in democracy. You can vote, you can donate money to a candidate, you can work on a candidate's campaign, you can write letters to your members of Congress and the state legislature and your local school board and your local city council. You can run for office yourself. You can join a lobby group or an interest group and lobby Congress. You can talk about politics with friends and families and neighbors. There are a lot of different ways in which you can participate in democracy. The way in which most people tend to participate in democracy is through voting, because voting is a very low cost alternative to participation, especially here in the state of California recently, that everyone gets an absentee ballot. So to vote here in California, you don't even have to get in your car and drive to a polling place. You can fill out your ballot at home. You can drop it in a vote box. You can drop it in the mailbox. It's a very simple, very easy way to participate. Doesn't require a lot of effort or a lot of resources. If you think about voters as being rational, self-interested actors, a rational, self-interested actor is going to want to maximize their benefits and minimizing their costs. Well, what better way to maximize your benefits and minimize your costs than by using a passive way of participation, such as voting? So, in terms of participation, people trend toward passivity in how they participate in government, in politics. Same type of thing in organizations. Organizations tend to create very passive employees who really don't have the opportunity, the wherewithal, or sometimes even the desire to participate in their own governance. A classic organization structure will lead to passive employees because there aren't a whole lot of avenues for participation in a classical type of organization. So what Follett wants to do is she wants to try and rectify these flaws in our democratic organizations. She says one of the best ways or most appropriate ways to rectify these flaws is through encouraging participation. Encouraging participation by having open systems of communication, both vertically as horizontally in our organization, allowing people, affording them avenues in order to participate. But whenever you increase participation and you allow people more avenues to participate in their own self-governance and the decision-making of the organization, it means you're going to have these different particularized interests that are going to come into conflict with each other. Conflict is a natural element of a democracy. Conflict is a natural element of a democratic organization. So Follett says in order to manage our organizations effectively, we need to come up with an effective way of dealing with this conflict. You cannot eliminate the conflict because if you eliminate the conflict, you eliminate the opportunity for people to participate in their own governance. So instead, there are three different ways you can deal with conflict. The first way is through domination. Now, Follett acknowledges that domination is the least attractive way of dealing with conflict because with domination, one party wins, one party loses. So the party or the person or the group that loses will always feel disaffected. They will never buy in to the decision that's being made by the organization. So she kind of discounts domination, says it doesn't work well in a democratic organization. The second way to deal with conflict is through compromise. And so you have the two parties, the two groups come to a compromise in which each group gives something up in order to arrive at this negotiated compromise. Well, because both groups are giving something up, neither group will be entirely happy. They are going to be somewhat disaffected because they're both giving something up. So it's not the ideal way of dealing with conflict. She says the most appropriate way of dealing with conflict in a democratic organization is the integration and interpenetration of ideas. By allowing avenues for participation, through communication, allowing people to express their ideas and to engage in their own self-governance and self-determination, what you do is you have all these different ideas that will interpenetrate from one person to another. So perhaps I never thought about this issue in this way. I talk with you, and now I see that there's another way of looking at this issue. So once you start getting that interpenetrative ideas, this exchange of ideas, that then allows you to integrate all of this information, all these different perspectives together, synthesize all that information into a new and different way of dealing with an issue or resolving a problem. So by integrating all this information together, that is the most effective and most appropriate way of dealing with conflict, because we have all had our ideas heard. We have all participated in the synthesizing of this information into a new and different way of dealing with the problem. So we all have buy-in in that new solution. The more buy-in we have in that solution, the more likely we are to then support the implementation of said solution. So I think that when we view organizations from a democratic perspective and we view dealing with conflict more through integration and this interpenetration of ideas, I think that is a very positive way of viewing organizations. The criticism, though, is it can also be viewed as kind of a Pollyannish way of dealing with conflict as well, in that depending upon the size of the organization, the functions of the organization, the culture of the organization, the types of employees and positions within the organization, not every organization is going to be amenable to this sharing of ideas and this integration and interpenetration of ideas. So at least in a classroom setting, here on a Wednesday evening, I think it makes a lot of sense to us. But when you think about your organization that you work in, if you're working in an organization, you may see that it's not 100% practical in your organization. Another way in which Follett kind of departs from the classical theorists is in the classical theorists, they looked at power as being very centralizing, a very top-down type of exercise of power. And it's kind of beyond the scope of this class to get into a nuanced discussion about power. I do that in my 500 course, but it's kind of beyond our scope to do that here. But a basic definition of power is the ability to use resources to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do. So if you're utilizing resources to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do, you are then exercising power over that individual. In the classical school, power was exercised in what Follett would refer to as a power over manner, in that leaders, managers would exercise power over their employees. They would utilize these resources to get employees to do something they otherwise would not do. Follett argues that in a democratic organization, rather than a power over approach, we should use a power with approach. And in a power with approach, we view power as a resource to be developed as opposed to being a resource to be given. So in a power with type of an approach, leaders and managers in democratic organizations work with their employees to help their employees develop their own resources. And it's something that you help them develop as opposed to something you bestow upon them. So you can see in this democratic organization, it's much more based upon participatory management or participative management, in that we are empowering employees to participate in decision-making and to participate in their own self-governance. Very much a stark contrast to what we saw with Weber and Taylor and the more classical types of theorists. In this participative type of management approach of Follett and her democratic organization, there are principles that she believes that we should adhere to in democratic organizations to allow more participation. Things such as focusing on coordination through the use of integration between departments and individuals. So the coordination that Follett is viewing is a much more aggressive view of coordination than what we had in the top-down approach of the classical theorists. Here we are coordinating through the integration of ideas between individuals and departments through this kind of interpenetration of ideas type of example. Early contact, making early contact with our employees, making sure that our employees feel empowered, making sure our employees know all the avenues for participation so that they have this open communication system in which they can take advantage of. Taking into account all perspectives in the organization, not shutting down perspectives and opinions that do not align with the opinions of a leader or a manager. Through taking into account all those perspectives, you are then allowing for this interpenetration of ideas and this integration to occur. And realizing that this communication system that you are creating, that this coordination that you are fostering and facilitating, that this is all very dynamic in nature, that this is changing the communication system, the coordination that you establish today may not be equally appropriate tomorrow or the day after that or the day after that. So it's important for us to understand and to recognize that it's a very dynamic situation in terms of the ways in which we are managing our democratic organizations. So it's clear that with Follett, she is giving us the opportunity to break away from the classical theorists, and she really lays this framework for us to then develop a new school of organization theory known as the Human Relations School. When we view Mary Parker Follett within the context of the models of organizational effectiveness, there is still an internal process type of focus. We're still looking internal to the organization. There are goals that we are still trying to achieve, but the primary goal that we are trying to achieve is still an organizational goal. So we are allowing for this participation. We are running our organizations in a more democratic manner for the purpose of making our organizations more effective and more efficient. So there's still that rational goal type of orientation. Then obviously the one that we are adding on here that we didn't see with the classical school, the human relations model. Because now we are looking more at dealing with our individual employees, allowing them opportunities to participate, developing their power resources, building cohesion, building morale among our employees, a much more human relations type of orientation. In terms of our mechanisms for coordination and control, this is again a very stark departure from what we saw with our classical theorists. Here we're looking at mutual adjustment in terms of consultation with our workers, allowing them the opportunity to participate in decision-making as opposed to just doing coordination through direct supervision or standardization. Here we're allowing people to participate, we're taking them into account. By taking them into account, paying attention to them, asking them about their opinions and perspectives, we are then motivating them through this approach known as considerate leadership. In considerate leadership, we are again paying attention to people. It's a leadership style where we're attentive to employees, we're attentive to their needs, to their wants. We want to build morale by paying attention to those employees, a very considerate type of leadership approach, as well as group acceptance, allowing people to work together in groups and to share ideas and interpenetration of ideas among members of these groups. And job identification, creating work that is interesting, that is challenging, that creates responsibility and accountability, going beyond just the one best way to do the job and allowing people to be creative in participating in the redesign and the reconstruction of the work that they are doing on a daily basis. So now, thanks to Mary Parker Follett, we have started adding on different models of organizational effectiveness. We've now been introduced to mutual adjustment as a mechanism for coordination and control, and job identification and considerate leadership as the way in which we are motivating our employees. But at the end of the day, as the people like to say, and I like to say as well, the ultimate goal is you're doing all of this to make the organization more effective. So we have not really gotten into a discussion yet about doing this for the benefit of employees. We're doing this to motivate employees to work harder, to be more productive, to achieve higher levels of performance for the purpose of making the organization more effective and achieving those organizational goals. But Follett is important because she really does help move us away from the classical school and really helps us move us more toward this new school known as the School of Human Relations Theory. So let's kind of see in the School of Human Relations Theory the contributions of Follett and how Follett has kind of pushed us toward the creation of this new human relations school. In the Human Relations School, a couple of the authors we typically talk about are people like Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger. Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger developed some of the very similar theories that were first developed by Mary Parker Follett, but interestingly enough, they developed them independently. So there's really no evidence that Mayo and Roethlisberger read Follett's work, were familiar with Follett's work. A lot of the theories they developed, they just developed a decade or two or three after Follett had developed those very similar types of theories. But in the human relations type of approach, we are now starting to pay attention to individual employees. So individual employees are no longer just cogs in the machinery. They're no longer just the boorish beasts that can just be plugged into positions, told what to do, and then eliminated and removed if they are not doing the job in the way in which they are supposed to do that job. Now we're going to start looking at individual employees and paying attention to individual employees. Elton Mayo, who is probably the most well-known, if you will, human relations theorist, was very concerned in his writings about this problem he identified as social disorganization. He felt that in the 1930s and the 1940s, we had a lot of this social disorganization. He looked at a lot of our organizations, a lot of our factories and industrial centers, and he saw a lot of irrationality. He saw a lot of problems in these organizations. He felt they were not well organized. He felt that they really neglected to take into account the social dimension of having a bunch of people under one roof working together and hopefully working toward the achievement of the same organizational goals. Well, why was that a problem? Why did that problem occur? That problem occurred for a couple of different reasons. The first reason why we had this social disorganization in our institutions was because of what I refer to as human irrationality. We know whenever you are dealing with human beings do not always make rational decisions. Human beings do not always make decisions that are congruent with their best interests. Mayo would argue that a lot of this irrationality comes from the Industrial Revolution. He says as a result of the Industrial Revolution, we saw the creation of all these factories and all these industrial centers, especially in northern Rust Belt cities. So, my hometown of Cleveland and Detroit and Chicago and New York. And that's where most of these industries started to grow up. These industries, when they were established, needed employees. They didn't have enough people to work in these factories. At the same time as industry was growing, agrarian society was shrinking. And so people who traditionally worked on farms started losing their farms. It was not as a work or labor intensive operation anymore to work in an agrarian society. And so we saw a lot of people, especially in southern states, who no longer could support themselves working on farms. And so they then start migrating northward to these major industrial centers. Well, a lot of these people, when they left their homes and moved up to these northern industrial centers, they did it at a very early age. They left home at ages 14, 15, and 16. They were very young. And so when these young people then moved into these industrial centers and started working in our factories, they had not come to the maturation level yet in that they have not yet worked out a lot of the psychological issues that we all work out with our families as we go through our teenage years. And so, because you had all these young people working these industrial centers, they were bringing with them a lot of those unresolved psychological issues. And that then created a lot of this disorganization, a lot of these problems within our industrial centers. The factory system itself, according to Mayo, also contributed to this social disorganization. Our factories were very dehumanizing places where people had one specific job. They did that one specific job every day, day in and day out, oftentimes in some very unsanitary and unsavory types of conditions. And so our factory system itself did not really promote a lot of independence and independent thinking on the part of our employees. So what Mayo wanted to do is he essentially wanted to look at a variety of different work settings, analyze those work settings, and try and come up with some theories as to how we could better organize those work settings and make those work settings more productive and achieve higher performance levels. So he did a variety of different social science studies, and we're not going to go through them all, but the one we're going to focus on is probably the one that you know, and that's the most famous one, the illumination studies at the Hawthorne electrical plant. And if you're familiar with the Hawthorne studies, you know that what Elton Mayo and his colleagues did is they went into the Hawthorne electrical plant and they had a variety of different hypotheses. Their hypotheses really focused on, if we change an external stimulus, what impact will this change in a stimulus have on the productivity levels of employees in this electrical plant? So what he did is he said, let's first look at things like lighting levels. So commonsensically, if you increase lighting levels in the plant, people will be able to see better and they will become more productive. So they turn the lighting level up. Sure enough, people became more productive. So you can check that hypothesis off as confirmed. Then the opposite hypothesis is, well, let's turn the lights down. If we turn the lights down, people won't be able to see as well, and so therefore productivity will go down. They turn the lights down, productivity continued to increase at even higher levels than it had increased when they had turned up the lighting level. So it wasn't the external stimulus of increasing or decreasing the lighting level that affected performance. It was that these people were being paid attention to. The researchers were talking to these subjects. They were asking them about their opinions, their perceptions. They were asking about their experiences of doing their jobs on a daily basis. By merely paying attention to these folks, they started working harder, they felt they were more valued, and they achieved higher productivity levels. They also recognized that when they put people into groups, that groups tended to outperform individuals. And one of the reasons why groups were outperforming individuals is because when you put people into a group, and if you've done this in group work before in your classes, you know that sometimes there's a person or two in your group that may not be pulling their weight, may not be contributing to the group. So the other members of the group will then exert pressure on that person to work harder and achieve higher performance levels. Essentially, the importance of the Mayo study is that Mayo and his colleagues recognize the social aspect of organizations. That if we completely disregard the social aspect of organizations, we are never going to be able to achieve the levels of effectiveness and productivity that we want to achieve as an organization. So we need to recognize that organizations are social systems and people are social animals, and that we need to provide them with those social outlets. And those social outlets and things like informal groups are oftentimes just as important as our formal organizational structure. Fritz Roethlisberger, who was a student of Elton Mayo, took Mayo's theories and used them to develop what he said was a new discipline. So he said, we can take these theories of the importance of the social aspect of organizations, and we can use it to create a new discipline. And he wanted to create a new discipline that was focused on communication. That if we are assuming that there's a social dimension to our organizations, we need to understand how to create an open, free-flowing system of communication within those organizations. We also have to focus on the ability to gain the cooperation of our employees, that an effective leader or manager is able to get the cooperation and the compliance of their employees in order to make the organization effective. Leaders and managers cannot do it on their own. They need to have the compliance of their employees. And then the discipline also needs to recognize that things change. And that what we're trying to do is we're trying to find an equilibrium. We're trying to find a balance in our organization between the needs of the individual employee and the needs of the organization, recognizing that that balance can change and will certainly change over time. So we have to be adaptive whenever we create this new discipline. But taking Mayo and Roethlisberger together, what they tell us together is that organizations are social systems. The classical theorists did not recognize the social aspect of an organization. They only looked at the formal elements. We need to take into account the informal social elements as well. And then another human relations theorist that contributes to this discussion is Chester Barnard. And Chester Barnard is someone who pops up again and again in this organization theory course. One of the important aspects of Chester Barnard is he kind of picks up on the Roethlisberger argument that we need to get the cooperation of our employees, and says that the only way our organizations can be effective is through leading through compliance. Leaders and managers need to recognize that they have to get the acquiescence, the compliance on the part of their employees in order to achieve organizational goals. So it's not enough just to say, you need to do this and this is how you need to do it. You need to get people to comply with those directives. Barnard also recognized that every individual employee is different. And so they're not just these identical cogs in the machinery, but they are different from each other. Every individual employee has their own set of incentives that they value. Every individual employee has their own ethical system, their own norms, their own values and ethical standards. And if we treat everyone the same, we are going to end up violating the ethical principles of some of our employees. If you violate the ethical principles of your employees, you will never then get their compliance. So this is what's known as this theory of the zones of indifference. Every employee has a different zone of indifference. If you can operate within that zone of indifference and you ask them to do things that do not violate their ethical principles, that do not violate their standards, you will probably get their compliance, you'll get their acquiescence if you provide them with the right incentives. However, if you ask someone to do something that is outside of their zone of indifference, they'll no longer be indifferent about that request. You will now be violating their ethical principles, and perhaps no amount of incentives will then be enough to get that person to comply with what you would like for them to do. But recognizing that each employee has their own set of incentives that they value, that each employee has their own different zone of indifference, we're treating employees differently. We understand that each employee is not the same, and we need to know those employees, communicate with those employees to understand what they incentivize and to understand what their ethical standards and their ethical expectations are. So taken together, the human relations theorists, Mayo, Roethlisberger, and Barnard, not only recognize the social aspect of the organization, but they also recognize the importance of understanding differences between our employees. And so we do see a lot of elements of human relations theory in our contemporary modern organizations, things such as counseling programs. Your organization most likely has an employee assistance program or an EAP. That's a counseling program that's provided to employees to help them work through a variety of different issues. Again, it's a recognition of the social aspect of managing human subjects. Training and development, professional development programs are also artifacts of the human relations approach. that back in the classical school, if someone wasn't doing the job correctly, you would just get rid of them. You would fire them. Here, we're helping people remedy problems with their performance through training and professional development. So it is placing more emphasis on individuals and treating individuals more as human beings. The criticism that's associated with human relations theory, though, is the reason why we are paying attention to employees and the reason why we are treating them as human beings is so we can get their cooperation, so we can get their compliance. Once we can get their cooperation and compliance, then they can contribute to organizational goals, and that will then help the organization be more effective. So our ultimate goal is a macro level organizational goal, as opposed to the goal being to develop individuals as human resources. And that was the big criticism of the human relations school that then led to the development of a new school of organization theory known as human resource management. But when we look at the human relations school, again, we see that it's really moved us very far away from the classical school. And in terms of our models of organizational effectiveness, obviously the human relations model, that's kind of intuitive, is the model of effectiveness that is emphasized. In human relations, we are trying to focus more on individual employees, develop more of a cohesive workforce, enhance employee morale. But the purpose of enhancing morale is to get more out of those employees to meet the goals of the organization. Because we are kind of still doing this top-down process, and because our goal is still an organizational goal, there's not as much mutual adjustment perhaps as direct supervision. There is still very much of a top-down type of an approach to human relations theory, because we are essentially exploiting is probably too strong of a term, but we are trying to manipulate employees in order to get them to contribute to the effectiveness and the goals of the organization. In terms of motivating our employees, by paying attention to them, we're engaging somewhat in considerate leadership. They're being paid attention to, they're being asked their opinions and their perspectives, which will motivate people. The more people feel that they are being treated equitably, the more people feel that they are being paid attention to and they're being valued, the more likely they are to be motivated to work harder. And then group acceptance. Mayo tells us and Roethlisberger tells us that human beings in an organization, as social beings, certainly do work together in groups. And so we have to accept that groups operate within our organization and then leverage those groups, because those groups can actually perform better than individuals. And so it's very much this social type of an approach. But it is still top down, and we're still just trying to get the compliance and the hard work of our employees to then make our organizations more effective. But that's what we consider to be the human relations school, our first real rejoinder, our first real major response to the writings of the classical theorists. And like we said with the classical theorists, a lot of classical theory is still alive and well in modern organizations. As we pointed out, a lot of human relations theory is still alive and well in organizations today. But because of that concern, that the whole goal of human relations theory was in a top-down way to kind of exploit workers, to get work and effort out of those workers, then that gave rise to a new school, which is the Human Resource Management School, and that's a school that we will talk about then next week. But I thought getting through pre-human relations and human relations theory would kind of clear the decks a little bit and set the stage for next week. When we get together, we will talk about human resource management theory. I'll introduce you to some human resource management theorists. We'll talk about some of the substantial differences between human relations and human resource management theory. And then we'll talk about human resource management theory, this focus on developing individual employees as human resources, how that then gave rise to a whole new body of literature known as the motivation literature. And I'll take you through the motivation literature, and we'll talk about how human resource management theorists then gave us this new body of literature, if you will, that focuses on how effective organizations can better motivate their employees, primarily through the use of intrinsic as compared to extrinsic types of motivators. So next week, we'll do human resource management theory, we'll do motivation theory, and then at the end of class, we'll probably have some time to do some breakout groups. That will then get us through next week's class. Then again, Juneteenth, we do not have class because of the Juneteenth holiday. Then on the 26th, when we get back together, we'll shift our attention to some more modern theories of organization theory. We'll go through group theories. We'll go through organization culture, quality management, leadership theories. And I'll take you through some of those more modern theories up to the contemporary period of time. And then in our final class session on July 3rd, we'll reserve the entire time that night to doing our presentations. If there is anyone who is not going to be in attendance at our July 3rd, our final Zoom session, and you need to do your presentation earlier, please send me an email, because then we can put you on the agenda for June 26th to make sure that you're able to do your presentation if you're not going to be able to be in class on July 3rd. I know it's a little awkward to have a class session on July 3rd, but if we didn't do that, we would have been down to 4 sessions instead of 6 sessions, and there's just no way we'd be able to cover all the information we need to cover in order to set you up to then perform well on your organization theory case study in 697. Okay, that's all I have to say for this evening. Any questions or any observations on human relations theory, Mary Parker Fall, Elton Mayo, Fritz Roethlisberger, or Chester Barnard? Okay. All right, if not, then we will call it quits for tonight. I will get this video up onto our Canvas site sometime tomorrow morning. Oh, I'm sorry, Kelsey, go ahead.
Oh, I had a question for about the Canvas essay. I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little more on like how to compare the is it the public versus the private organizations?
Sure, absolutely. It's a great question. Depending on the organization that you are using for your organization analysis paper, so if you're using a public organization, then I think what's useful is to think about kind of a corollary organization in the private sector. So is there an organization in the private sector that kind of does something somewhat similar to what this government organization is doing? And so if there's kind of that correlation between the two organizations, I think it makes it a little bit easier to compare them. But in terms of two similarities and two differences, the similarities could be in terms of their functions. It could be in terms of how they are organized. It could be in terms of the types of employees they have. It could be in terms of the types of external pressures and external forces they have to contend with. In terms of the differences, oftentimes those differences tend to be in terms of staffing, how we hire people, how we manage personnel, the type of revenue that we rely upon. In the public sector, we tend to rely upon appropriations, which are very stable. In the private sector, we rely upon profits, which tend to be very unstable. So things like that in terms of differences, sometimes some of the differences in the environment as well. So there could be similarities in the environment, but there can also be differences too. Government organizations tend to work in very political environments as opposed to private organizations. So for those two similarities and those two differences, identify what those two similarities and two differences are. And then just kind of think about, what does it mean then? The big so what question. What does it mean for how we study those organizations? So does having a different hiring process and having less control over managing our employees in the public sector, does that really impact the way in which we study those organizations? Maybe if we have less control over our employees, maybe some of these human relations and human resource management theories are going to talk about, maybe they're harder to implement in the public sector because we don't have the same control that you'd have over in the private sector. The private sector, you can always use bonus pay and pay for performance. You're much more limited in doing that in the public sector. And so, maybe if you're trying to apply a pay for performance system to enhance organizational effectiveness, that may not make a lot of sense in the public sector, but may make a whole world of sense over in the private sector. So that's kind of the idea for that post. Does that make sense? Does that help?
That helps. Yes, thank you.
Okay, sure, perfect. Any other questions? Anything else before we call it a night tonight? Okay. If not, I hope everyone has a good remainder of your week, and then we'll be back at it next Wednesday talking human resource management theory, motivational theories, and then hopefully having a little bit of time left so that we can do another breakout exercise. Thanks, everyone. I will talk to you then again next Wednesday. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor. Good night.
Thank
Thank
you. Good
you.
night.
Thanks. Have a great night.